In the final spring of World War II, as the Pacific Campaign reached its most violent crescendo, few Americans knew that a small U.S. Navy logistics group had slipped out of Ulithi Atoll under a veil of routine. Yet buried in the margins of operational notes from March 1945 lies a curious anomaly. References to a forward supply detachment, whose mission was never fully detailed, whose escort arrangements were imprecise, and whose end remains a blank space in official wartime records. For a conflict obsessively documented, this absence is unusual, an omission that would later trouble naval historians and surviving sailors alike. The detachment's task, at least in broad strokes, was critical. With Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, set to begin within days, ammunition ships, medical cargo vessels, and smaller supply transports were being funneled northward in vast numbers. The U.S. Fifth Fleet relied on an unbroken chain of logistics. Every crate of 40mm shells and every pallet of plasma bags mattered. Yet this particular group's paper trail, though unquestionably real, appeared strangely thin. A departure time from Ulithi. A general destination. A cargo manifest that seemed too modest for the units preparing to storm the Ryukyu Islands. Then, abruptly, nothing. The struggle of this moment was less about firepower and more about coordination. Ulithi, by March 1945, was the busiest naval anchorage in the world. Hundreds of ships, battleships, escort carriers, oilers, repair ships, destroyers, moved in and out in a constant tide. Amid this immense machinery of war, supply detachments were often overshadowed by frontline formations. But sailors who served in these groups understood their vulnerability. Their vessels were slow, lightly armed, and often sailed in small, dispersed packets to reduce congestion along key routes. "We were always told to keep our heads low and our radios clean," recalled Seaman First Class Raymond F. Anders in a post-war interview. Convoys were safe. Detached supply ships? Not so much. To understand the danger they faced, one must consider the broader context. The waters between Ulithi and Okinawa, stretching across the Philippine Sea and toward the East China Sea, were a battleground of shifting threats. Japanese submarines still prowled the region, including Kaiten-equipped units desperate for a final victory. Aircraft from Kyushu frequently conducted long-range harassment raids. Even surface picket boats, though few remained, still ventured out on suicidal scouting missions. That a small, under-escorted logistics group would choose this moment to sail suggests urgency, something vital enough to justify the risk. The reveal came slowly years later, as researchers pieced together dispatch logs preserved in the National Archives. One message, transmitted from Task Force 51 headquarters, noted the movement of auxiliary elements toward forward staging zones southwest of the Ryukyus. Another, partially smudged and incomplete, referenced a need for supplemental medical stores for casualty overflow. These fragments suggested the detachment may have been carrying materials intended for the first waves of the Okinawa assault, supplies that would be desperately needed as casualties mounted in the opening hours of the landing. And yet, the deeper one digs into these records, the more puzzling the gaps become. Why were escort destroyers not clearly listed? Why was the precise cargo manifest missing from the standard logistical reports? Why did subsequent operational summaries omit the detachment entirely? Naval archivists often chalk such anomalies up to clerical overload or wartime chaos, but the pattern here feels intentional, or at least unusually opaque. Reflecting on this, modern analysts draw a sobering lesson. Even in the most documented war in history, entire events, entire ship movements, can slip into obscurity, overshadowed by the scale of the conflict. The Pacific War was a tapestry woven from countless decisions made under pressure, and some of those threads were inevitably lost. As Part 1 closes, one fact stands firm. The supply detachment left Ulithi sometime in late March 1945, bound for the vast and contested waters leading to Okinawa. They sailed into a night thick with humidity and uncertainty. Ahead of them lay a battlefield waiting to ignite. Behind them, only a thin trail of incomplete memos, scattered log entries, and half-preserved notes. And somewhere in the hours that followed, the sea swallowed their presence entirely. How a group of vessels vanished without a distress call, and why the Navy's own records would struggle to account for them, becomes the central question leading into the next chapter of this mystery. Nightfall on March 28, 1945, swept across the Philippine Sea with the same unsettling quiet that had unnerved so many sailors during the Pacific Campaign. For the small U.S. supply detachment bound for Okinawa, that silence was both a blessing and a threat. Under standard doctrine, such groups maintained strict radio discipline as they entered contested waters. Yet what followed in the next hours would not be a matter of deliberate silence. It would be a sudden, complete blackout that left no distress call, no SOS, not even a fragment of static to indicate struggle. One moment, their faint signals were recorded in routine logs. The next, they vanished entirely. To appreciate the significance of this silence, the struggle of the convoy must be understood through the eyes of the men who crewed such ships. The vessels primarily used for forward supply detachments, Liberty ships, cargo APAs, and smaller auxiliary craft, were never built for battle. Their decks carried only modest armament, a few 20mm Oerlikon cannons, perhaps a 3-inch gun at the stern if they were fortunate. Their best defense was predictability. Sailing in numbers, following established routes, moving under the wing of destroyers or destroyer escorts whenever possible. But the pre-invasion congestion meant the Fifth Fleet's resources were stretched thin. Some transports inevitably had to travel in smaller packets or with minimal covering force. A notation in a surviving communication log, marked just after 1800 hours, listed the detachment's position as on schedule. It was recorded by a radio operator aboard the attack transport USS Cambria. Minutes later, that routine entry would become the final confirmed signal ever received from the group. Past 1830, every attempt at communication, intermittent calls, hailing signals, coded channel checks, returned only silence. No reply. Static only, one operator scribbled in the margin of his sheet. It was not an unusual occurrence for brief intervals in these waters. But total loss from an entire group was another matter entirely. The broader historical context helps explain why Allied commanders were immediately concerned. In late March, Japanese forces were preparing massive kamikaze strikes against the fleet positioned for Operation Iceberg. Submarine patrols had intensified around the approaches to Okinawa, and American intelligence believed the Imperial Navy was prepared to sacrifice remaining assets to disrupt supply lines before the invasion began. The sea lanes the detachment entered were among the most dangerous in the Pacific. The Japanese submarine I-361, known to have carried Kaiten suicide torpedoes on earlier missions, operated in these waters around this time. So did aircraft from bases on Kyushu, which often flew night missions in loose formations, searching for isolated targets. But despite these threats, no confirmed enemy attack was reported in the sector that night. Destroyers on picket duty did not list torpedo wakes or aerial contacts. No emergency flares were sighted. No explosions were logged by nearby vessels. Only a few ambiguous radar blips and faint flashes that would later stir debate among analysts. A quote from the war diary of Lieutenant Commander Harold Jeffers, serving aboard the destroyer USS Porterfield, adds another layer of insight. The night was unusually still. Our screens picked up distant clutter, too weak to classify. Hard to tell if it was weather or metal. Jeffers was known for precise observation, making his note intriguing when contrasted with the silence from the supply group. If there had been a brief, violent encounter, an ambush from a submarine or a sudden airstrike, Jeffers and others might have heard or seen the aftermath. Yet no such record exists. The reveal, then, is not a dramatic sighting but the absence of one. For all the chaos of the Pacific War, naval engagements almost always produced evidence. Oil slicks, explosions, radio calls, or debris. Here, there was nothing. Just the quiet fade of signals, as if the convoy had stepped beyond the edge of a map. Historians reflecting on this period emphasize the dangers of assumption. Sometimes, the lack of evidence is not a clue in itself but a byproduct of the environment. Poor visibility, distance, or communication limitations. Yet in this case, the silence occurred in a region monitored intensely by Allied forces in the days leading up to the Okinawa landings. That makes the gap harder to explain. By dawn, The convoy's failure to report triggered alarms throughout the fleet. Search patterns were assigned. Reconnaissance squadrons were briefed. The machinery of wartime response was set in motion, though without a starting point or a distress call to guide it. As Part 2 closes, the mystery deepens. A U.S. supply detachment, small, vulnerable, but essential to the invasion, sailed into one of the most monitored regions of the Pacific and simply disappeared from the radio waves. No signals. No warnings. No trace of struggle. The next chapter begins with the first attempts to locate them, and the strange fragments of sightings that would only compound the confusion. In the early morning hours of March 29, 1945, as search efforts began to sweep across the waters south of Okinawa, an overlooked but critical detail emerged. Several U.S. destroyers operating under the Fifth Fleet had reported brief, unconfirmed radar contacts during the very window when the supply detachment disappeared. The logs were not dramatic, just a handful of transient returns, recorded with the same clinical precision used to document weather changes or course adjustments. Yet these faint blips, lasting no more than seconds, would become some of the only tangible clues in a case defined by absence. The struggle to interpret these contacts must be understood through the limitations of the technology at the time. The surface search radars used by U.S. destroyers in 1945, most commonly the SG or SC series, were reliable but far from infallible. They could detect ships at impressive distances, yet their screens were often cluttered by sea reflections, atmospheric interference, or erratic thermal layers. Operators spent hours staring at green-tinted echoes, distinguishing friend from foe, squall from vessel, while exhausted crews performed their routines in near-total darkness. Against this backdrop, a handful of fleeting radar returns could easily be dismissed as noise. One destroyer, USS Hutchins, noted 2 contacts at roughly 23:10 hours. Low, unstable reflections that appeared on the edge of the radar sweep before vanishing. Moments later, a similar entry appeared in the war diary of USS Stevens. The logs did not confirm size, heading, or classification. They simply recorded the presence of possible surface vessels near the convoy's assumed route. At the time, these were treated as minor footnotes. Only after the supply group failed to report did their relevance become more apparent. But radar was only one piece of the puzzle. Several pilots from a night reconnaissance squadron flying F-6F Hellcats off the carrier USS Bataan also contributed observations that would later raise questions. During an early morning sweep around 0200 hours, at least 2 aircraft reported seeing isolated flashes at sea, sharp bursts of light, spaced irregularly, followed by darkness. The pilots could not identify whether the flashes came from gunfire, flares, or explosions. Their altitude, combined with the haze common in the region, made it difficult to determine distance. "Pos faint AA flashes," one pilot wrote in his after-action note. Unclear source. The insight offered by these reports is not in their certainty, but in their ambiguity. Flashes at sea during wartime could signal many things: accidental discharge, strafing runs, misidentified lightning, or combat. But what troubled investigators was the location of these sightings, roughly consistent with where the supply detachment should have been at that hour. Yet when destroyers arrived to investigate at dawn, they found nothing. No oil slicks. No debris fields. No drifting rafts. The ocean's surface was eerily undisturbed. Adding to the puzzle was a brief entry from the destroyer USS Hall, which recorded hearing distant thuds at around 0100 hours, too muted to register as explosions, but distinct enough to be noted. The crew could not determine a bearing. Without visual confirmation, the sound was archived as unidentified. It joined a growing list of observations that suggested something may have happened, yet none provided a clear picture. To understand the weight of these fragments, modern analysts often compare them to the standard signatures of naval engagement during the Pacific War. Battles, even small ones, rarely left no trace. Torpedo strikes produced shockwaves, plumes, and significant debris. Gunfire often lingered as smoke or floating shell casings. Aircraft attacks left telltale patterns of splintered driftwood, life jackets, or spilled cargo. Here, though, the ocean was empty. The fleeting radar contacts, scattered flashes, and muffled noises formed a pattern without an answer. A post-war reflection by Lieutenant Commander Winston Hale, who served on the USS Bataan, sheds light on the uncertainty of the time. "The sea could lie," he wrote in a 1951 letter. "You could swear you saw something, swear you heard something. And by sunrise it was as if the night had imagined it." Hale wasn't speaking about this incident specifically, yet his sentiment captures the essence of the search. Even seasoned officers could be fooled by distance, reflection, or fatigue. Still, the presence of multiple independent observations, radar, visual, auditory, cannot be dismissed outright. They point toward the possibility of a brief engagement, perhaps one conducted swiftly and decisively. A submarine ambush in the dead of night? A lone aircraft attack? A catastrophic on-board detonation? Each hypothesis was considered, yet each had flaws. Submarines often left wreckage behind. Aircraft typically drew anti-aircraft return fire. Internal explosions usually produced floating debris. The reveal of Part 3 is not the discovery of what happened, but the realization of how much remains unexplained. The fragments hint at conflict, yet deny clarity. They deepen the suspicion but withhold resolution. As dawn broke and search operations intensified, crews began to fear the truth. Whatever had occurred might already be beyond the reach of rescue, or even beyond the reach of evidence. With uncertainty swirling through the fleet, Part 4 will follow the desperate search that unfolded at first light, and the strange items, oil slicks, and empty rafts that only intensified the mystery. First light on March 29, 1945, revealed a sea that looked deceptively calm. The pale horizon near Okinawa glowed with the faint shimmer of dawn, illuminating waters that had offered no clear answers through the night. By 0600 hours, several destroyers and support vessels assigned to emergency search duty had begun sweeping the region where the supply detachment was last expected. These searches were not improvised. The U.S. Navy had refined its maritime rescue patterns over years of conflict. Yet even the most disciplined methods struggled against the vastness of the Pacific. And on this morning, the ocean seemed determined to conceal whatever had transpired. The struggle for the search crews was both physical and mental. The seas were calm but deceptive, with long rolling swells that hid objects until the last second. Lookouts strained their eyes against the glare, scanning for anything, lifeboats, planks, oil slicks, that might indicate the fate of the missing ships. "It's like looking for a matchbook in the desert," a crewman from USS Hall reportedly remarked. Search patterns widened, then widened again, until they spread across hundreds of square miles. But hour after hour, the reports came back the same: negative. No contact. Then, just after 0830 hours, the first uncertain trace appeared. Lookouts aboard USS Hall spotted a thin sheen, something glimmering unnaturally on the water's surface. The destroyer altered course and closed in. What they found was a slick of heavy oil, spread thinly across a patch of sea hundreds of yards across. It was not enough to confirm a sinking. Tankers and cargo ships carried varying amounts of fuel, and oil slicks alone could be misleading. But it was the first piece of physical evidence that something had occurred nearby. The crew documented the slick carefully. Samples were taken and logged, though in the chaos of wartime, these were unlikely to be meticulously analyzed later. More telling was the discovery that followed minutes later: an empty life raft drifting aimlessly. The canvas was scorched in places but intact. Its rope lines were uncut. The markings were faded, weathered by the sea, and could not be definitively tied to one of the missing vessels. Still, it was enough to quicken the pulse of every man participating in the search. Insight came from the destroyer USS Morris, which had joined the search sweep from the south. Her deck crew recovered several planks of wood bearing scorch marks and a partially charred crate lid, indicating exposure to fire or explosion. The lid carried stenciling that might have once shown a supply code, but the letters were too fragmented to identify. These finds were strange: burned debris without any large wreckage field nearby. Normally, if a ship had detonated or been struck by torpedoes, the ocean would be cluttered with far more substantial remnants. Yet in this case, the searchers encountered only scattered pieces, drifting alone in quiet patterns across a vast expanse. Evidence present, but incomplete, noted a junior officer on USS Hall in his morning log entry. He would later underline that phrase, evidence present, but incomplete, as though the fragmentary nature of the find was more disturbing than if nothing had been found at all. The reveal deepened when pilots from the escort carrier USS Bataan relayed that they had seen no enlarging slicks, no smoke columns, and no floating bodies during their aerial sweeps. The absence of bodies was particularly troubling. Even in catastrophic sinkings, remains or life preservers often surfaced. But this sea was eerily empty. Not peaceful, but vacant, as though whatever had occurred had taken place too swiftly for survival and too completely for evidence to remain. Search operations continued into the afternoon, with vessels crisscrossing each other's paths, forming an intricate web of effort across the contested waters. Tension grew as officers debated possible explanations. A submarine ambush, a magazine explosion aboard one of the ships, a coordinated nighttime airstrike. Each theory had merit, yet none perfectly matched the scattered clues. A submarine attack should have left more debris. A magazine explosion would have been seen or heard by nearby ships. And a nighttime airstrike should have left patterns consistent with strafing or bombing. Yet the ocean offered only isolated burn marks and debris too light to confirm such an assault. A reflection from Lieutenant Commander Jeffrey Rowland, recorded decades later, captures the mood among the search teams. It felt like chasing ghosts. We had pieces of a puzzle but no center image. Something had happened. We all knew it, but the sea refused to give us the story. By sunset, the crews faced an unsettling realization. The physical traces they had found pointed toward disaster, yet lacked the consistency to explain it. No large wreck fields. No drifting survivors. No clear sign of combat. Just hints, oil, rafts, scorched wood, floating like unanchored clues disconnected from one another. As Part 4 closes, the searchers had no choice but to press on into another night. They had evidence of calamity, but not enough to conclude its nature. The deeper the investigators looked, the more the ocean seemed to resist revealing its secrets. Part 5 will explore the post-war revelations, Japanese patrol records, submarine logs, and conflicting accounts that only sharpened the mystery rather than solving it. In the years after the war, when the Pacific finally quieted and the fleets returned home, the Navy undertook the immense task of assembling a complete historical record of the final campaign. It was only then, far from the immediate pressures of Operation Iceberg, that analysts began noticing inconsistencies surrounding the vanished convoy. Wartime urgency had buried many questions. Peacetime reflection unearthed them. One of the first surprises came from a source no one had initially expected. Japanese operational logs that survived the destruction of the Imperial Navy. The struggle to reconcile these records with Allied reports began in the late 1940s, when American intelligence teams in Tokyo sorted through stacks of faded documents, submarine diaries, and partial communication transcripts. Among the logs was a set of patrol reports from several Japanese submarines believed to have operated in the Philippine Sea and the approaches to Okinawa in March 1945. These vessels included I-361, I-366, and a handful of coastal submarines assigned to scouting and infiltration duties. Their mission profiles varied. Some carried Caton-manned torpedoes, others simply conducted reconnaissance meant to disrupt the Allied supply chain. Yet the expected revelation never appeared. Not one surviving Japanese record explicitly mentioned attacking a U.S. convoy or even sighting a major target in the area on the night the supply detachment vanished. Many logs referenced poor weather, long stretches without contact, or evasive maneuvering to avoid Allied aircraft. The tone of these entries, mundane, matter-of-fact, occasionally resigned, did not match the anticipated record of a dramatic engagement. No suitable targets, wrote one submarine captain in a brief entry dated March 29. Another reported only searchlight sweeps from distant ships, unable to close distance. If one of these submarines had ambushed the convoy with Caton or torpedoes, historians reasoned, there should have been at least a hint, damage claims, patrol area coordinates, or even inflated victory reports common in the war's final months. Insight into the Japanese perspective came from a retired Imperial Navy officer interviewed in the 1960s by a U.S. naval historian. Speaking cautiously, he explained that by spring 1945, Japanese submarine command was increasingly fragmented. Coordination between boats was minimal. Crews were often inexperienced, and records from later missions were irregularly kept. Some logs were written days later, some never at all, he admitted. This complication meant the absence of a report could not be taken as proof that no engagement occurred, but it also made attribution nearly impossible. Compounding the issue were conflicting post-war testimonies. A few Japanese veterans recalled hearing rumors of a nighttime attack in the Okinawa approaches, but none could provide details. Others insisted no such action occurred. Some suggested that a submarine might have launched torpedoes without confirming the identity of the targets, a practice not unheard of in the war's final period. But without documentation or wreckage, these accounts remained speculation. The fog of war lingered long after the fighting had ended. The reveal came not through clarity but through contradiction. Analysts noted that several US and Japanese timelines overlapped suspiciously well. The disappearance of the convoy, the radar contacts, and the reported movement of certain Japanese submarines fell within the same 24-hour window. Yet the two sides' records refused to connect. One side described silence in the water. The other described an inability to find targets. Where they overlapped, they did so only in ambiguity. This inconclusive pattern reshaped the investigation. Theories emerged, each supported only partially by the available evidence. A submarine ambush remained plausible, but the lack of wreckage or survivor testimony weakened the case. A catastrophic onboard explosion, perhaps in ammunition or fuel stores, could explain the sudden loss, but search teams should have found more debris. A nighttime airstrike from Kyushu was another possibility, though surviving Japanese air records for that night were patchy, with sorties listed only in general terms. Even accidental collision in the dark, while rare, was not impossible. Wartime routes were crowded, and navigation errors did occur. But that too lacked supporting evidence. Reflecting on these uncertainties, a post-war analyst named Commander Douglas Marin wrote, "The absence of proof is not proof of absence, but neither is it license to invent a cause." He argued that the convoy's disappearance illustrated a difficult truth. Not every wartime event would have a clean narrative. Some would remain trapped between logbooks, unobserved or partly recorded, distorted by the chaos of battle and the immensity of the Pacific. As Part 5 draws to a close, the central mystery remains unresolved. The Japanese patrol logs clarified little. The American records filled gaps but left new ones exposed. Theories multiplied, but none achieved consensus. The vanished convoy lingered in the post-war imagination, not as a solved case, but as a cautionary reminder of how much even the most powerful navies could lose without a trace. In Part 6, the final analysis will explore the conclusions drawn by naval historians, why they settled on the most likely explanation, and why the story still resists closure 8 decades later. By the time historians revisited the disappearance of the convoy in the decades after the war, the Pacific had long since reclaimed its silence. What lingered was not the urgency of a wartime search, but the unsettling calm of a historical puzzle with missing pieces. Naval analysts of the 1950s and 1960s inherited fragments, partial logs, scattered eyewitness notes, ambiguous radar readings, and recovered debris too minimal to deliver final answers. Yet from this patchwork of evidence, they were tasked with producing conclusions, however provisional, to help explain one of the lesser-known mysteries in the lead-up to the Battle of Okinawa. The hook for their investigation emerged from the same insight that tormented the wartime searchers. Sudden silence was rarely accidental. Ships did not simply disappear from the ocean without leaving some kind of trace, be it distress calls, debris fields, or survivor accounts. The absence of these markers forced historians to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Whatever happened to the convoy may have unfolded so swiftly, and so catastrophically, that the crews never had time to react. This hypothesis guided many later assessments, though the question of what caused such a rapid event remained open. The struggle to form a coherent narrative drew analysts back to the environmental and tactical context of late March 1945. Operation Iceberg was only days away. The Pacific Fleet was at its peak operational tempo. Japanese forces were equally desperate, deploying every remaining resource to delay or disrupt the coming invasion. Submarines, Kaiten-equipped units, nighttime air raids from Kyushu, and even uncoordinated attacks by small surface craft still posed real threats. For supply ships, slow, lightly armed, and modestly escorted, this convergence of dangers was severe. One historian, Lieutenant Commander Robert Lansing, captured the dilemma in a 1964 Naval War College review. The convoy sailed through one of the most lethal corridors of the Pacific at a moment when both navies were stretched to their limits. It is entirely possible that the very conditions designed to conceal the convoy's movements also concealed its loss. Lansing's analysis leaned toward a submarine ambush as the likeliest cause, noting the sudden signal blackout and the scattered burned debris found the next morning. Yet he acknowledged the absence of torpedo wake sightings, explosion reports, or confirmed enemy claims left the theory incomplete. An alternative insight came from analysts who examined shipping accidents and magazine explosions during the war. Cargo ships carrying ammunition were vulnerable to catastrophic detonations triggered by mishandled ordnance, fuel vapors, or accidental fires. When such ships exploded, like the infamous loss of the USS Mount Hood in 1944, the result could be instantaneous destruction, leaving minimal floating debris. But those incidents typically produced a massive, unmistakable shockwave felt miles away. In this case, ships positioned fairly close reported no such blast. The possibility could not be dismissed entirely, but it carried its own contradictions. Another school of thought pointed to Japanese aircraft. Night raids originating from Kyushu often flew in loose groups, striking targets of opportunity. A single bomb or torpedo dropped on a supply ship could have caused immediate loss. Yet such attacks usually drew return fire, leaving gunners' reports or witness accounts. In this incident, none existed. Pilots from USS Bataan saw flashes at sea, but nothing that matched a sustained airstrike. Japanese sortie records were too fragmentary to confirm or deny involvement. Thus, the reveal the analysts arrived at was less about identifying a culprit and more about identifying patterns. The most plausible scenario combined several factors: poor visibility, scattered threat sources, and the inherent vulnerabilities of the convoy. A sudden attack, likely submarine-based, may have hit one ship first, triggering secondary explosions among munitions aboard the others. The violence of such a chain reaction could explain the rapid radio silence and the lack of survivable wreckage. It was a sober, conservative assessment grounded in known wartime mechanics. Still, many historians emphasized that the conclusion remained one of probability, not certainty. Modern reflections on the incident often dwell on its lesson rather than its solution. History, especially wartime history, is riddled with incomplete stories. Not every battle yields clear records. Not every ship leaves a grave marker. Some events slip between logbooks, swallowed by the very environment in which they unfolded. In the words of historian and Delaney, the Pacific was as much an adversary as any fleet. It kept its own secrets, and it still holds some of them. For families of the lost crewmen, whose names appear on memorial walls at Pearl Harbor, San Diego, and Manila, the story remains painfully unresolved. They know only that their relatives sailed toward Okinawa and never returned. Their ships are not marked on charts. Their final moments remain unrecorded. Their remains lie somewhere beneath the warm, shifting currents of a sea that has never explained itself. And so the mystery endures. The vanished convoy near Okinawa has become one of those wartime questions that refuses closure. Historians can outline the most likely causes. Analysts can map the probabilities. But the ocean keeps its silence. The night the sea went still remains, even today, a story of unanswered signals, scattered evidence, and a final crossing into uncertainty. An echo from World War II that continues to fade, yet never fully disappears.